Hello everyone and welcome back to Spirit of Thersites. Haven't made a video in a few weeks, so I figured I would get myself back on track by making an obligatory political compass video. This is the video where I take a quiz that tells me where I stand on the political spectrum. The political compass is divided between left and right, which mostly focuses on issues of economics and also more generally on how the government should function. The up and down bracket is authoritarian versus libertarian, and that's not only a measure of social issues, but also of enforcement mechanisms and severity. So I actually like this quite a bit, the political compass. I know a lot of people don't. They say it's biased. Well, guess what? All political tests are inherently biased. The political compass much more emphasizes economics rather than social issues. So if you're somebody who's primarily into social issues, you probably won't like this metric. There are also people who like to try to put people on a left-right spectrum based on sort of the totality of their views and just try to balance it out and then find where they stand left or right. I find that also has its own inherent problems because then you have to weight things in a certain way, which again introduces bias because again, you can't possibly rank other people's views without applying some sort of bias to it. If you're doing anything political or even anything historical, it's literally impossible to operate without bias. So all the people who talk about being objective really don't understand what they're talking about. Anyhow, let's take the test and get this over with. Alright, so the idea is they put forward a proposition, and then I basically express how I feel about that proposition, whether I agree, strongly disagree, or whatever. If economic globalization is inevitable, it should primarily serve humanity rather than the interest of transnational corporations. Strongly agree. All economic changes should be geared to benefit the majority of people, especially in a democratic system. Not only that, but one side note here, and while I won't try to overthink too many of these questions, on this one, that word inevitable, I guess, is triggering me, for lack of a better term, because I don't think anything's truly inevitable. Now, it does seem like the world will eventually go this way at some point, and a lot of leaders are pushing in that direction, but at the same time, nothing is ever truly inevitable. So I'm really not a big fan of that word applied to long-term historical developments. I'd always support my country whether it was right or wrong. Strongly disagree. I named my channel Thersites, for fuck's sake. What do you expect me to say? And I'm not the kind of person to click my heels, salute, and blindly follow along. I will say what I feel, and I don't really care. The Iraq War was a big wake-up call for me. At that point, I realized that this country is more than capable of making some massive errors in judgment. So, yeah, I cannot support decisions that I feel are fundamentally wrong. No one chooses their country of birth, so it's foolish to be proud of it. I agree. I wouldn't quite phrase it that bluntly, but I think that that's correct. I think that there are probably stupider things to be proud of, say one's race, which I guess we're getting to in a minute. But again, being born in a certain country is not an achievement. It just means that your parents had an orgasm 9 months before your birth. So there's only so proud you should be of that. That being said, if you're proud of your national heritage and you want to learn more about your culture and ancestry, that's all cool, but it should be kept within some reasonable limit. Our race has many superior qualities compared with other races. Strongly disagree. I don't think that any race is superior to any other race. Scientifically, that's basically been proven at this point. Even the people who try to push evidence of racial inequalities or differences in racial abilities really find statistical outliers that don't add up to shit, and the methodology was usually pretty botched. At this point, to believe that one race is actually legitimately superior to another, you pretty much have to be scientifically illiterate. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. I disagree. A person could be a useful ally or a temporary friend or whatever, but if the person is not inherently on your side, if they don't share your views and your values, they're not really your friend. They can still be very useful and important, but that does not necessarily make them your friend. Military action that defies international law is sometimes justified. I strongly disagree. I don't think that is ever the case. International law is there fundamentally to protect common people from the ravages of war and the worst abuses of authoritarian regimes and things of that nature. Violating international law is not a good idea. The consequences of it will be worse than whatever benefit you might gain by violating it in the first place. There is now a worrying fusion of information and entertainment. I keep wanting to say infotainment because I'm just reading ahead and merging those two terms in my head. I actually don't think this is a real concern, at least not a major one. I disagree. I think all of us are aware that something like The Daily Show is not truly news. That being said, because of the obvious similarities between something such as The Daily Show and then the coverage that you get on CNN or MSNBC where the hosts try to be entertaining or witty by making puns, I think it's obvious that it is the job of the news media on some level to try to keep people engaged, and at the same time, it's the job of comedians to talk about things that are somewhat serious. That being said, because the division is not super clear, a lot of people don't think seriously enough about where and how they acquire their information. That being said, I'm not really sure what you actually do about it. And I'm not sure that it means that information is irrelevant or necessarily wrong just because the person delivering it is concerned also about trying to be entertaining. It's like saying that you can't trust the historian Herodotus because he's a good writer. He spends too much time trying to be quippy and memorable, so you can't trust him. It just strikes me as a little dumb. And while I do see where people are coming from on this, I think that their worries are a little misplaced. Section 2 out of 6. The economy. Talking attitude. So, alright. People are ultimately divided by class more than nationality. I strongly agree. I think that your fundamental experience on a daily basis from the time you wake up to the time you go to bed is primarily conditioned by what class you are, not by your nationality, race, or gender. Let me explain. So you wake up in the morning, you take a shower, you go to work, you drink coffee, etc. The quality of the bed that you slept in, how long you can take a shower, your working conditions, your pay, quality of your home, how well heated it is, the car you drive or transportation you take to work, what you come home to in the evening, all of those things will be more conditioned by your class than by any other factor. The quality of the coffee even. So that's where I stand on that. Nationality can have a huge impact, especially if you're lower down the economic totem pole, or if you are a persecuted minority, of course, in a country. It's not to dismiss that at all, but the one thing I can guarantee you is that the lives of wealthy people across the world are way more similar than the lives of poor people across the world. Although the lives of poor people across the world often mean encountering similar hardships. So I feel that you can have more similarities with someone from a vastly different country than you might with an upper crust person in the ruling class of your own nation. Controlling inflation is more important than controlling unemployment. I disagree, but not strongly. In general, if I had to choose between those, I would definitely choose trying to curb unemployment. That being said, you don't want inflation to get out of hand. A certain amount of inflation, I think, is necessary. However, you don't want it to get above a certain percentage because then, most likely, the cost of living will exceed any wage growth, and that will lead to a lowered standard of living. At the same time, it is not socially healthy or economically sustainable to have a large permanently unemployed population. So, it's a balance, but ultimately, I think that controlling unemployment is slightly more important. Because corporations cannot be trusted to voluntarily protect the environment, they require regulation. I strongly agree. You cannot trust corporations to regulate themselves or obey rules on any level. The profit motive is what drives them fundamentally. In fact, in America, the main job of corporations as defined by law is to make sure the shareholders make profit. And one way to make profit is to cut corners on environmental regulations. If you want companies to not dump waste into the water, you have to have regulators on the job with power to do something. From each according to his ability to each according to his need is a fundamentally good idea. This, of course, is a famous Karl Marx quote. I strongly agree with this. I think that this is an excellent general principle. That being said, in practice, I would definitely be asking a lot of follow-up questions. Who determines what people's ability is? Who determines what their need is? How would that look practically? I mean, those would all be things I'd be concerned about, but in terms of just as a general principle, I think that this is spot on. The freer the market, the freer the people. Strongly disagree. See Augusto Pinochet for details. You can have a free market without having any kind of personal freedom. You can also have a free market and have freedom. These two things do not necessarily go together. And especially after the Cold War and the wake of the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, one thing that you saw is that a lot of times free markets were more or less imposed from without on the newly freed peoples of Eastern Europe, for instance. And this is not necessarily something that they wanted, and it caused an economic shock. Actually, it was sort of a deliberate shock doctrine. So this is not necessarily part and parcel of freedom. It is a sad reflection on our society that something as basic as drinking water is now a bottled, branded consumer product. I strongly agree, and I even say that as someone who occasionally does purchase bottled water. The fact that we have not done a better job of protecting the purity of our water supplies and that we have to have bottled water in certain parts of this country and in the world as a whole is deeply troubling. We should be putting a lot more resources into making water purity a priority, especially in a place like Flint, which had a functioning water system until the fucking governor, Rick Snyder, ordered them to switch to a new pipeline constructed by his buddies. Yeah, that is a very sad reflection of our society, to say the least. Land shouldn't be a commodity to be bought or sold. This one's a little tougher. I am somewhat skeptical of land ownership because this is a way to build up generational inherited inequality. Inheriting land is a massive asset that one can use to get a leg up on others. That being said, obviously, owning a plot of land was more or less necessary for agriculture throughout most of this nation's earlier history. And owning a nice piece of land to settle down on it has a lot of appeal to it, I think, especially for most people. I'm not as into the whole land idea, but I know a lot of people who are. I'm on the fence about this one. But my gut feeling is that I agree with the statement that land shouldn't be a commodity to be bought or sold. I'm not really sure exactly what the alternative would be, and there are certainly some alternatives I'm familiar with which aren't terribly good, such as the state divvying out fiefdoms controlled by the emperor like they did in Byzantium, at least at one point when the central government was very functional. Yeah, I guess I agree, but I don't really know exactly what the preferable alternative is. It is regrettable that many personal fortunes are made by people who simply manipulate money and contribute nothing to their society. Strongly agree. A lot of people who do investments don't really do very well for the people who invest their money with them, but they do very well for themselves. Day traders are also people who I don't really see their value. I don't get what they contribute. Yeah. Not to mention people who bet on markets and all that kind of stuff. I really don't see their value. Protectionism is sometimes necessary in trade. I strongly agree. I think that you have to be very strategic about where you place tariffs and on what. It needs to be targeted in a way that favors native manufacturing without hindering the ability of people in your country to access goods. And one thing that I would never put a tariff on are raw materials. So, in the past, I've said that I'm in favor of tariffs, but I'd criticized Trump's trade policy, and people were trying to accuse me of having a contradiction, but Trump's tariffs were not well done. He did increase tariffs on imported steel, for instance. I would only impose tariffs on imported finished goods. So that's the difference, really. The only social responsibility of a company should be to deliver a profit to its shareholders. Shockingly, I strongly disagree. I think that companies should be required to contribute to the communities that they're a part of, especially companies such as Cabela's, which comes into towns, gets a lot of local tax breaks for a long period of time, and often leaves before they pay a single cent in taxes. So companies should be much more beholden to their communities and to their workers than to the shareholders. Now, they also owe stuff to the shareholders. As an investor, you should be able to make money. But there should be some limits, and fundamentally, the economy and all of its parts, including companies, should work fundamentally for the good of the whole, rather than the good of a few at the expense of the whole. The rich are too highly taxed. Yeah, right. Strongly disagree. The rich pay ridiculously low taxes, especially with all the loopholes that they have, and we need a progressive taxation system. The more that you benefit from the system, the more that you should pay into it. After all, it's working mostly to your benefit anyway. What exactly is the complaint? If rich people operate the trucking companies, or own them at least, that do most of the damage to the roads, but yet they don't want to pay taxes to repair the roads. Makes sense. Okay, those with the ability to pay should have access to higher standards of medical care. Strongly disagree. I don't think that your wallet should have any impact whatsoever on the quality of your health care. That is completely and utterly immoral. And I hate moralization in general, but I do find myself morally revolted at the idea that someone with money should be getting better health care than someone without it. That they are more worthy of life because they have a higher credit limit on their MasterCard. It's fucking nauseating. Governments should penalize businesses that mislead the public. Strongly agree. I am all in favor of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. One of the greatest things that Obama did that sometimes goes under the radar and unfortunately has not really had any teeth as of yet, and probably won't under Joe Biden because, well, he's fucking Joe Biden. A genuine free market requires restrictions on the ability of predator multinationals to create monopolies. Yes, it does. Strongly agree. The only way a free market, and again, I'm skeptical of the idea of a free market as a real thing. It's sort of like pure communism as envisioned by Marx, in the sense that it not only never has happened, it never really will happen. You might come somewhat close-ish, but it's never really going to happen. You're always going to have people trying to set up some rules that will either benefit them or manage risk in some way. So there never will be a true free market anywhere at any time. That being said, if there are monopolies, then the market is restricted. Even if there's a monopoly in another field that's only sort of directed by extension to your field. So for instance, McDonald's and the fast food companies are heavily able to exercise influence on the way that chicken is harvested in America because they have certain requirements for the chicken that they buy, and they're one of the major consumers. So you pretty much have to limit the influence of companies and their size in order to keep a free market competing and innovating. Because if you don't break up monopolies, then it leads to stagnation. Let's move on. Section 3. Personal social values. Let me get a drink real fast. Okay. Abortion, when the woman's life is not threatened, should always be illegal. Strongly disagree. I'm pro-choice. In general, I'm also just pro... If it comes down to a matter of non-essential for survival stuff, I'm always in favor of the individual. If it comes down to this thing is life or death, in that case, I'm much more on the side of communitarianism. So that's kind of where I draw the line. All authority should be questioned. I strongly agree. Now, there are times where if you don't know something, you probably should shut up and listen. But in general, it is good to question authority and to give some pushback. Try to be constructive, but do give pushback. That's a good idea, fundamentally. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. As a political rule, I don't like this. On a personal level, I kind of do, though, low-key. But politically, let's see. I'm going to go disagree. I'm kind of ambivalent about a lot of eye for eye, tooth for tooth punishment schemes, but yeah, it really depends on the situation. Politically, I don't like it as an institutionalized thing. On a personal level, I think that it's different, though. You know, if somebody fucks with you, you should fuck with them back to teach them a lesson, but I don't necessarily want an institution as powerful as the government being run in that way. And that's why I'm much more skeptical of, say, Richard Nixon than my friend Sean. Because I don't like the idea of someone with that personality and that outlook running the country. It's just not a comforting thought. Taxpayers should not be expected to prop up any theaters or museums that cannot survive on a commercial basis. I strongly disagree. For the most part, theaters and museums are not really self-sustaining. They can self-sustain, but if by commercial basis you mean that they can operate with a profit, then you're probably dreaming. For the most part, with a museum, you're doing fairly well if you can break even, and as long as the taxpayers are only having to make up, say, 10% of the budget or whatever, that's not that bad, and it's a local asset, not to mention a local place of employment. So, yeah, I think it's a public good. That's something that's pretty cool. Schools should not make classroom attendance compulsory. I disagree. I think that you should have to attend school. I'm okay with, say, laws where you can drop out at a certain age or whatever if you decide that you're not interested. That being said, while you're in school, I think that you should have to attend. That being said, I've heard of people like Kamala Harris when she was the Attorney General in California threatening to jail parents whose kids didn't attend school. And the thing is, once your kids are teenagers, they have enough physical ability and enough willpower to skip school if they're really dedicated to doing it. I don't think that you should face jail time for the actions of another person. So that's why I can't go strongly disagree. But yeah, it is important that people have some shared experience through school to build some minimal level of social cohesion and to make sure that everyone has some level of viability when it comes to their employment options. So I think that it is important to attend school. All people have their rights, but it is better for all of us that different sorts of people should keep to their own kind. What the fuck? I just strongly disagree. No. I don't... Is this an argument for segregation? Like, what the fuck is this even? Because I agree with this first clause, all people should have their rights. All people have their rights, but it's better for all of us to stay separate. I strongly disagree. Yeah, I think that is a segregation question. I'm not sure. That's weirdly anachronistic, though, even if this was originally made in 2001. I guess the people who made it maybe had silent gen parents they wanted to quiz. I don't know. Good parents sometimes have to spank their children. I'm ambivalent on this. I don't think that spanking your children is inherently bad. That being said, I don't know if it's actually necessary. There are parents who can discipline without spanking. I'm going to have to go with disagree. Now, my parents did spank me sometimes, not very often, but occasionally. I don't know if it was effective or not exactly, but I think there are different ways to parent, and I don't really want to judge people too harshly on the methods that they choose. Now, obviously, you can only go so far with spanking a child, but in general, I don't think it makes someone a bad parent to utilize spanking, as long as the child understands why they're being spanked. But in general, clearly it is possible to discipline children without spanking them, and ideally that's what you'd want to do. It's natural for children to keep secrets from their parents. Yeah, absolutely. Whether it's imaginary friends or porn stash or whatever it might be, that's just how kids are. And yeah, I think that is part of sort of developing your individual identity in a way, is sort of having some secret, no matter how small, that no one else knows, some hidden inner self that other people can't quite access, no matter how well they know you and even if they raised you. Possessing marijuana for personal use should not be a criminal offense. I strongly agree. I don't understand the penalization of marijuana in the year 2020. It makes no sense to me at this point. We know that it's not really that harmful. 1, 2, half the people use it anyway. And 3, you can easily sell it in stores and collect a lot of sales tax. So why the hell not? The prime function of schooling should be to equip the future generation to find jobs. Okay, if it's prime function, I have to disagree. I do think it is one of the major functions of education. But in general, I actually think the primary purpose of education in a democracy is to provide people with the basic knowledge that they need to participate in that democracy. So I will disagree, but not strongly. People with serious inheritable disabilities should not be allowed to reproduce. Strongly disagree. That's absurd. That's fascistic and just like some eugenics horseshit. That's terrifying. Let's move on. The most important thing for children to learn is to accept discipline. Strongly disagree. Children need to also learn to think for themselves, need critical thinking skills if they're going to really make it as citizens. And because the workplace is becoming more individualized and more initiative-driven, where you have to sort of figure things out on your own to some extent, just teaching kids to click their heels and count to 10 is not going to get the job done. Also, memorization, rote memorization, except for learning languages, is really not that useful in education anymore. But unfortunately, you do have to have rote memorization to learn languages, especially complex ancient languages. There are no savage and civilized peoples, there are only different cultures. I agree. I don't strongly agree, but I do agree. There are certain practices within some cultures that I can see people finding horrifying, and that I also would find horrifying and disgusting. But as a general rule, I don't think it's wrong to be different. And I don't think it means that something is inferior because it is different. So, I will go with agree. Those who are able to work and refuse the opportunity should not expect society's support. This one is a little more complicated because there's not enough context. What is the work opportunity being offered? Well, okay, so let's generalize it completely. If you're offered the opportunity to work, you refuse the opportunity. Yeah, because what I have pictured is the idea of going up to somebody who's semi-disabled and the only job you're offering them is hard manual labor and their back is completely shot. And And I'm not sure exactly why that came to mind, because those kind of jobs aren't even that common anymore, but that was kind of the picture that popped in my head immediately. I guess it also depends on what level of societal support we're talking about. This is one I can't really answer very well because there just isn't enough meat on the bone here. I'm going to have to go with disagree, but a very weak disagree. Because the principle itself, I don't really object to it, but there is some context I would need to really hash this out. And also the idea of, if you have a degree and you were working in some field and then you wanted to stay on unemployment to avoid taking up a job at Wendy's or some shit, I would be on that person's side 100%. So I guess I'll have to go and disagree. When you are troubled, it's better not to think about it, but to keep busy with more cheerful things. That sounds like everything my dad has ever said. I disagree. I don't strongly disagree because I think it is important to try to keep moving to some extent. But yeah, you do need to think about what's going on in your life. You do need to take some time to reflect. You do need to hash things out to some extent. You can't just ignore it. You can't just let it fester. First-generation immigrants can never be fully integrated within their new country. How old is the first-generation immigrant? Okay, I shouldn't overthink all these questions, but I do know people who moved here as very small children and they're completely integrated. If you immigrate, say when you're my age in your mid-30s, you probably won't quite fully integrate. That's not to say that you won't be successful and happy or whatever, but I'm gonna have to actually. Well, I'm leaning between disagree and strongly disagree. I guess that puts me at disagree. But I think you can. A lot of people do, but not everyone does. Yeah. What's good for the most successful corporations is always ultimately good for all of us. Fuck no. Hell no. Not at all. Usually it's the exact opposite. Whatever's good for corporations is almost always bad for us. Labor deregulation. That doesn't favor the common person. Lowering regulations and standards for safety in products does not help us at all, but saves money for corporate America. Environmental deregulation saves them money, but causes cancer among common people. So yeah, this is literally the exact opposite of the truth. No broadcasting institution, however independent its content, should receive public funding. I disagree. I think that there is a place for just basic, bare-bones, factual news. NPR being that. That being said, as a general rule, I don't like the idea of a government-controlled media at all. So, yeah, this one, I think that sort of the implications of this question should be spread out over a few different questions to really get at all the nuances inherent in this. But as it stands, I only slightly disagree. How do you see the wider society? Our civil liberties are being curbed in the name of counterterrorism. Absolutely. Most of the measures that were taken after 9/11 were completely superfluous, and it was security theater. We have at least 5 or 6 different national security apparatuses with somewhat overlapping missions. Most of them aren't really that necessary. The NSA records phone conversations. A lot of telecommunication and tech companies are complicit. What's it all for? If you post the wrong thing on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever, you might get a call from the FBI. Or actually, they don't call, they just come to your door. Yeah, that's a good idea. A significant advantage of a one-party state is that it avoids all the arguments that delay progress in a democratic political system. Strongly disagree. In a one-party state, there's still a lot of factionalism between people in the party. Look at the Soviet Union. There was a lot of factionalism, despite there only being one party. Not only that, but even if you look at, say, the internal workings of the Democrats or Republicans, you still see that there's a constant state of sort of low-intensity civil war, and that it's rare to have party-wide movement on something. So, yeah, one-party states do not necessarily make more progress just because there's not a democratic system in place. Whenever you have any group of people who are empowered to debate one another and haggle for influence, you will have the same dynamic present that you have in a more full democracy. So why not just go with one where everybody can participate, rather than limiting it to a handful of people? Although the electronic age makes official surveillance easier, only wrongdoers need be worried. Strongly disagree. It's not a healthy thing for a society, especially a free society, to have government officials monitoring what everyone is doing. Not to mention when you have people employed by these agencies who themselves could potentially be weirdos, who might either have some vendetta on a personal level against somebody, or they might try to sell information to make money. It's just not a good idea to have this kind of information available and then have people who can access that information. I don't think it's a positive development. The death penalty should be an option for the most serious crimes. I'm deeply ambivalent on the death penalty. I'm very much on the fence about it. I guess I'll have to go with disagree, just because there have been too many instances of people who later were proven to be not guilty, who were executed prematurely. And I'd rather err on the side of caution when it comes to taking someone's life. That being said, there are some people who have gotten the death penalty, and I've been completely cool with that decision. So, pretty on the fence about the death penalty. In a civilized society, one must always have people above to be obeyed and people below to be commanded. I strongly disagree. Again, this whole inevitability, or it must be this way, it must be that way. No, it doesn't. And we're in a constant state of change. Most adults probably don't encounter a lot of this sort of hierarchy in their personal lives. A lot of them don't even encounter this at work. It's not necessary. People can be equal and still function. I believe. It's not that hard. Now, I think it'll be a very long time before we get to the point where people as a whole get to experience that, but maybe I'm an optimist when it comes to human nature, but I believe that people can operate without a strict hierarchy, especially a strict social hierarchy. Now, you do have to have elected officials who exercise power, but hopefully they should not have some inherent social advantage that makes them a permanent ruling class. Abstract art that doesn't represent anything should not be considered art at all. I strongly disagree. I personally don't like abstract art, but that doesn't make it not art. It can still express something. It can still express things. And in general, I'm not into that kind of gatekeeping where you try to say that something is not an example of art or writing or history or what have you. That's just, I don't think, productive at all. If you really don't like something within a field, just help make something that you feel is better than that, rather than bitching about it not really being actual art or whatever. Yeah, just be productive. In criminal justice, punishment should be more important than rehabilitation. I strongly disagree. Most criminal offenses don't come with life sentences. And the idea is that after serving their time, people will go back and clean up their lives and become productive citizens. So rehabilitation in the form of everything from counseling, drug rehab, and job training should be the priority in prison. You don't want people to become more violent. You don't want them to feel socially isolated. You don't want them to feel too stigmatized or at odds with society as a whole. You want to keep them somewhat engaged with the larger society, so that way they're less likely to fall into the recidivism trap. And you also don't want them to keep their association with whatever prison gang they end up in, because a lot of people in prison end up in gangs. So the way to do that, I think, is to focus more on rehabilitation than punishment. Punishment is obvious when you're in prison. I mean, being in prison sucks. So that's the punishment. And you're there with a bunch of people, some of whom are dangerous and assholes. So, yeah, there you go. That's seems like punishment enough to me. It is a waste of time to try to rehabilitate some criminals. I strongly disagree, with the exception, of course, of obvious people who had mental illnesses that are severe, say serial killers. But for the most part, if you are dealing with criminals, most of them are probably reachable on some level. And even the ones who can't really be fixed can still be improved in some way. Maybe they just behave better in prison, even if you can't really trust them to be free. So I think that this is a worthwhile project, and that should be the focus of the prison system. The business person and the manufacturer are more important than the writer and the artist. Strongly disagree. Couple reasons. First of all, business people are interchangeable. Manufacturers are interchangeable. Sounds like a cruel thing to say, but you can replace any manager with any other manager and the show goes on. If you lose a writer or an artist, at least a good one, then you've lost something that you will never be able to fully replace. You've lost the thoughts of a person who will never again live. You lose a manager, you can replace him with somebody who's basically identical, and the show goes on. But so yeah, I think that's the main reason I feel this way. And in general, if you really think about what defines a culture, what defines life, it's definitely the work of writers and artists more so than business people and manufacturers, I would say. Not to say that they don't serve an important function, but ultimately they're pretty much all interchangeable. Mothers have careers, but their first duty is to be homemakers. I strongly disagree. I think that should be a personal choice. If a woman chooses to be a homemaker, bully for her. If she chooses to emphasize her career, bully for her. If she chooses to try to balance those two things by working part-time and then being home in the afternoons, bully for her. If she tries to have it both ways and go 100% career and 100% with her kids, bully for her. Let women do what they want. Again, if it is something that is not life-threatening, I am 100% in favor of whatever the individual wants to try to do with their own life. Life is a finite resource, and the people who possess their own lives should be able to use their life however the hell they please. Multinational companies are unethically exploiting the plant genetic resources of developing countries. Meaning banana republics, basically, going into places and stealing their fruit and produce. I strongly agree, because I know the outline of the history of Latin America. Making peace with the establishment is an important aspect of maturity. I strongly disagree with that. If you don't agree with the establishment fundamentally, and you think that the country's heading in the wrong direction, if you think that the way that your industry or field is going is not correct, if you think that there's a fundamental flaw, I believe it's your responsibility to oppose it. You have to fight back. Maybe you fight back within the system, but you still have to keep fighting back. Making peace with the establishment does not make you an adult. It doesn't make you mature. It makes you a pussy. Let's be clear about that. That's what it makes you. Let's keep going. 5 out of 6. This is taking way longer than I thought. Religion. Astrology accurately explains many things. It explains literally nothing. It's interesting to look at in a newspaper, but that's about it. You cannot be moral without being religious. Nonsense. There's no relationship between moral and ethical behavior and religiosity. You could be very religious and very moral, very religious and not moral at all. You could be somewhere in the middle on both. It's completely random. There's no correlation. Charity is better than Social Security as a means for helping the genuinely disadvantaged. Strongly disagree. That's ridiculous. Charity is very much dependent on personal relationships, and as you age, your social circle diminishes. especially if you live in a small community. And a lot of people's disabilities tend to not be as social because that's part of their disability. So if you're dependent on people looking out for you, have a vested interest in looking out for you, that is not a viable way to live and survive. Not to mention that it is a burden on all the people who are forced to try to look after relatives, friends, and neighbors who can't look after themselves if there's not some economic baseline being provided by the government. Some people are naturally unlucky. I agree, I think. I think I agree. It's like somebody who, say, develops a rare illness in their 20s or 30s or whatever and just drops dead, or if you're the only soldier in a battle who gets wounded or killed and all your comrades are fine. Yeah, I think that would be an instance of bad luck. And there are some people who have shit happen to them over and over. I mean, there's some people who had some horrible childhoods full of unfortunate events. So I agree with this. In general, I'm not into sort of mystical woo-woo explanations that involve any kind of supernatural anything. So I don't really think there's like a force in the universe called luck or fortune. But I do think that by random chance, some people have gotten the wrong end of the stick over and over. It is important that my child's school instills religious values. I don't have children, but I strongly disagree. I also would never want to teach at a school that tries to instill religious values because I have no religious values. So that would be a tough fit, to say the least. Let's go on. Sex. Best for last. Sex outside of marriage is usually immoral. Strongly disagree. Sex is always cool. As long as it's two consenting adults, everything is good. A same-sex couple in a stable, loving relationship should not be excluded from the possibility of child adoption. Strongly agree. I mean, kids need a home, especially kids who are living in orphanages. It's better for them to have a home. And there's nothing wrong with being raised by a couple of gay dudes or a couple of lesbians. They're just as capable of parenting as anybody else. Pornography depicting consenting adults should be legal for the adult population. Strongly agree. I don't see any legitimate argument in favor of banning porn. That's just dumb. What goes on in the private bedroom between consenting adults is no business of the state. I strongly agree. That is not something the government should ever have a hand in. No pun intended. No one can feel naturally homosexual. I strongly disagree. My sister was always very clearly homosexual, and it must have come natural to her. And also, given that until recently gay people have been looked down upon by society as a whole, it is very hard for me to believe that someone willingly chose to be gay. It's like, I want to be a part of this demographic that gets made fun of all the time. That sounds like a good idea. These days, openness about sex has gone too far. Strongly disagree. I don't think it's gone far enough, honestly. I don't see why sex should be stigmatized. I think it's kind of dumb. It's actually immature to be uncomfortable at talking about sex. Anyway, let's see where I stand. I didn't read this part, but yes, and they're right. It's really hard to put Stalin and some other people in there because Stalin's social views are super right-wing, but his economic views are super far left. So you have to reconcile those things in some way. Alright. So Gandhi is libertarian left, Stalin is authoritarian left, Hitler barely right, but very authoritarian, even more than Stalin apparently. Wonder what Stalin wasn't authoritarian on. I'd be curious to see what that was. Thatcher is pretty firmly in the middle of the neoliberal spectrum, which I guess is authoritarianism plus right-wing economics. And then I guess this would be more of the traditional libertarian spectrum. So neoliberalism and libertarianism are the same here. That's interesting. Because I actually think there's some differences between those two as economic philosophies. Especially when it comes to state involvement. But, okay. Anyway, let's get on. Alright, so I am minus 9.5 economic left-right, and social libertarian minus 7.95. Sounds about right, and that's about where I usually place when I take this, somewhere in that vicinity. Although, mentally, I pictured it being about right here-ish. Because I told my girlfriend earlier about the political compass, and that's about where I thought I'd end up. But, yeah, same difference, I guess. So there you go. There is my highly original, super high production value, incredibly entertaining video on my personal political compass test. Until next time, I'm Spirit of Thersites. Peace out.